Well, good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I would like to welcome you to this webinar on gender equality in agriculture that ISD is hosting to present the key findings of a recent publication called Leveraging Voluntary Sustainability Standards, or VSSs, for Gender Equality and Women Empowerment in Agriculture. That has been made possible thanks to the support of the International Development Research Center and the Government of Canada. Thank you all for being with us today. We have approximately over 110 participants registered to this webinar, which shows an interesting turnaround and interest in the topic. My name is Cristina Larrea, and I am the lead of the Sustainability Standards Program at ISD. And it's my pleasure to moderate this discussion with the author of this guidebook, Kathleen Sexsmith. Hi, Kathleen. Good morning and welcome to this webinar.
Thank you.
I would like to briefly provide some background about Kathleen for the audience, just to understand who is she and what is her background before we start discussing with her. Kathleen is an assistant professor of rural sociology and women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Penn State University in Pennsylvania. Broadly speaking, her academic and policy research agenda examines gender roles and identities in agricultural work among immigrant farm workers in North America and smallholder farmers in Central America and Mexico. Kathleen has written research papers on sustainability standards and provided guidance on addressing gender issues for ISD Economic Law Program since 2008 on an on and off basis. And she is the author of an ISD report published in 2017 that the current guidebook builds on, which is called Promoter Gender Equality in Foreign Agricultural Investments, Lessons from VSSs. So welcome, Kathy, to this webinar, and welcome all of you. Before we start with the discussion with Kathy, I would like to briefly go through the agenda. We will start with some introductory remarks about the role that women play in the agriculture sector and some facts about existing gender inequalities. Then we will move to explore the reasons behind this publication, the target audience, and the analytical framework used that links VSSs with sustainable development goals and with gender concerns in agriculture. We will follow the discussion with Kathy to understand how can standards contribute to gender equality and women empowerment based on her research. And we will also learn about points of caution or opportunities for improvement to be considered by development practitioners when implementing activities related to VSSs with farmer groups and rural communities. We hope that following this discussion, we can engage in a dialogue with you all in the questions and answers section. As a housekeeping note, you can formulate your question in the question and answer chat on the bottom of your screen. I would most appreciate if you can identify yourself with your name, and then I can address your question directly to Kathy. Without further ado, let's start with some introductory remarks. Just to be able to set the table about the woman empowerment and gender equality, I would like to share with you some highlights about the topic. As we all know, woman empowerment and gender equality is one of our main topics of concern in our societies. Has always been important, but in recent years, it has become a top priority for many governments, private sector, and civil society actors. There are several factors that have contributed to it, such as the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals that address gender equality and women empowerment issues, as well as the impact of some global social movements that made a strong call or action to address the roots of gender inequality at many fronts. In order to have a quick look about what is the progress of closing gender gaps in our societies, we can have a look about a recent publication of the World Economic Forum regarding the Global Gender Gap Index, which, as we can see in the slide, highlights some progress made in closing the gender gap in areas such as health and education, but in other indices such as political empowerment or women economic participation, there is a strong areas of opportunity. Obviously, this is like a generic index that is made of limited indicators researched across a number of countries. I think it's around 150, but it provides us at least with a generic overview about where we stand. And what this global index tells us about the opportunity for women to strengthen their role in in the economic life as well as the political empowerment, we see that too happening in the agricultural sector. As we all know, women represent 40% of the agricultural labor force, and in some countries it can go up to 60%, like in sub-Saharan Africa. FAO estimates that if women had equal access to productive resources as men, such as education, financing of land rights, they could increase agricultural yields by 20 and 30%, benefiting household revenue and reducing people living in hunger. However, globally, women are just 13% of agricultural landholders. They are underrepresented as a leader in leadership roles in agricultural producer groups, and there is a large wage gap between employed women and employed men. As another example, women produce approximately over 60 to 80% of the food in most developing countries, but they are more likely to experience food insecurity than men. And even this might lead to have some health problems such as anemia, which affects 29% of young women between 15 and 49 years old. This is just two examples about to highlight what is the important role that women play in the agriculture sector, as well as existing inequalities. And we all know that addressing and advancing gender equality and women empowerment is a complex process, as it touches the individual dimension of women, the community dimension, as well as the society dimension. It refers to addressing the cultural norms, institutions, policies, and regulatory frameworks that lie behind these gender inequalities and define the roles that women and men have in the public and private domains that limit women access to resources, for instance, or their capacity development and their exercise of agency and decision-making power. So in this complexity and given the importance of this topic in our society, Kathy, why this publication now? What for, and who is addressed to?
Yeah, well, so thank you for the questions and for the very nice introduction laying out the key issues that this publication is concerned with. So Christina, as you just described so well, gender equality and women's empowerment in agriculture remains a very pressing challenge throughout the Global South and is prominently addressed in the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. And so we've found significant overlap between the Sustainable Development Goals and voluntary sustainability standards, specifically with respect to agricultural sustainability and gender equality in agriculture. And so primarily this overlap is in Sustainable Development Goal 2, which is zero hunger, SDG 12, which is responsible consumption and production, and SDG 15, which is life on land. And so what we try to do in this publication is show that VSSs, or standards, can help to meet global gender equality goals in agriculture through two different means. One is the gender-focused certification criteria that increasingly standards are incorporating into their certification processes. And then secondly, the activities on the ground that producer organizations, development organizations, and other actors are undertaking when they adopt these criteria and implement them. And so this publication is the first one, to our knowledge, to specifically identify the links between voluntary sustainability standards and those gender equality and women empowerment targets of the SDGs with respect to agriculture.
Excellent.
So the second half of your question was, who are the audiences? So we think and hope that this publication can reach several audiences. First would be those who read the 2017 report that Christina mentioned earlier, which had looked at basically the way that lessons regarding gender equality from the implementation of voluntary standards can be applied to responsible investment frameworks, which are sort of a newer body of voluntary regulation for the agriculture sector. Another key audience for the guidebook would be development organizations who work in sustainable agriculture. And so that might include people who do field work and outreach and extension, those who do research for development think tanks and organizations, and those who make decisions about their programming.
Mm-hmm.
We also think it will be relevant for the standards organizations within the agricultural sector. So those who are designing the standards and their policies, overseeing the certification process, and even those who are interested in compliance or inspecting compliance. There's a significant review of the available academic literature as well as policy literature about gender equality in agriculture in this guidebook. So we think it's also relevant to academic and policy researchers. And then finally, as we know, globally, the world is striving to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And so those policymakers who are trying to push their societies onto that sustainable path will also be interested in the ways and the connections that the guidebook makes between standards and those goals.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So it's a wide range of audiences. I would like to remark that it's a very hands-on guidebook then, that tries to support the role that development organizations on the ground do with the rural communities and farmers when using voluntary sustainability standards, as well as standard setting bodies and other stakeholders that contribute to influence the development of their criteria. Very good. So as you mentioned in your first introduction, this publication relates voluntary stability standards with sustainable development goals and gender equality concerns. Can you please provide us some insights about how this analytical framework was developed? Because I think it's quite innovative.
Sure. So the way that it was developed was through a series of steps. So the first thing that was done was to identify the gender targets and indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the SDGs are much more gender mainstream than the previous Millennium Development Goals. And so that was done manually, and then it was cross-referenced with a UN Women 2018 publication that did a similar exercise. Then the next step was to narrow down those targets and indicators to the ones that were most relevant to the agricultural sector. After that was done, they were grouped together according to theme, because through the process of that exercise, I had observed that some of the targets reappear, or similar versions of an issue reappeared a few times. So for example, women's rights to land and women's rights to agriculturally productive resources is mentioned in SDG number 1, no poverty, as well as SDG 2, zero hunger, and SDG 5, gender equality. And so it was a process of grouping them according to those themes. Mm-hmm. Another example is the women's decision-making and empowerment related targets were covered by 2 different sustainable development goals. So then what we did, moving on to how they were integrated across SDGs and standards, what we did was we looked at specifically the 5 voluntary sustainability standards that have the broadest market reach, as well as the most history, making efforts to incorporate gender equality issues. And they're also the same 5 standards that were analyzed in the 27 guidebook, and read through their criteria to identify overlap between those themes that had been identified from the SDGs and the content of the voluntary standards. And so just so you know, the standards that we decided to look at were Fair Trade International for both smallholders and hired labor. Then we have IFOAM, or the International Federation of Organic Agriculture Movements, guidance document. We have Rainforest Alliance, UTZ Certified, and the Common Code for the Coffee Community. So at the time that the research was done, Rainforest Alliance and UTZ Certified were still sort of firmly 2 separate standards at that time. And so we found that some were very specific to gender, and those were coded green in the guidebook, and others were not quite as gender focused and were not coded green. And then we created a checklist. And so you can see, looking across the rows, that the coverage is not equal for all of the standards. So some of the subcategories, for example, like maternity leave, is covered by some standards, but not all. Other topics like no tolerance for sexual harassment is explicitly addressed in almost all of the standards. And then we had to decide which issues to leave out, because some of them were not specifically relevant to agriculture, and so or were not specifically discussed by VSSs. So I'd be happy to answer a question about that later.
Very good. Okay. So basically, yeah, you develop a strong analytical framework defining cross-cutting theme across gender issues, standards, and sustainable development goals, and you analyze standards criteria based on that, as well as existing evidence on the ground about how are being implemented on the ground, in order to have this, traffic light, green, yellow, and red, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Very good. So let's move to explore some of the findings of this report based on the analytical framework that we set up. Based on your research and the available evidence, Kathy, how can standards VSSs contribute to gender equality and woman empowerment?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we found there's many ways in which we can identify a relationship. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that these relationships don't necessarily hold across all contexts. And so the studies that I reviewed are very sort of localized. And so what we did find is that in many local contexts, there is a positive relationship between VSSs and women's empowerment. And so one example would be its contributions to household food security. So standards can promote dietary diversity, for example, through shade trees or intercropping. And they can also promote higher incomes that can contribute to nutritional security for women when they have control of the income stream. We also found that standards can help improve women's access to credit and to raise their incomes, which can be used for agricultural production. So an example of how this might work would be the fair trade premium price or pre-financing mechanisms that can be used for development projects that can generate income that women can invest in agricultural production. We found with respect to education, there's a fair number of studies that have started to look at this question, and the evidence so far shows that standards equally promote education for boys and girls. Particularly, there was a study in Costa Rica that found that this effect can extend to secondary school, where children might otherwise be more likely to drop out of school to work. So as incomes rise, families don't have to draw their children out of school to go to work. And they equally continue to enroll boys and girls in that study. It can also contribute to gender equality with respect to the unpaid labor that women perform in the home. And it can do that by supporting the purchase of labor-saving investments. So for example, using communal funds earned through premiums to purchase a corn processing mill in Latin America would be an example of how that's been demonstrated to happen in the literature. It can promote greater participation in the production process for women, as well as in producer groups. So as women perform more labor with the added requirements for quality and environmental protection with certification, it can promote their participation in household decision-making. And also it can promote their participation in producer groups, because most standards have very strong criteria with respect to non-discrimination and including women in decision-making processes. And then also it can contribute to decent workplaces and healthy working conditions for women. And that's in particular because the criteria for employment conditions are usually stronger in standards than in national laws. So with things like providing maternity leaves, providing healthy and safe working conditions for pregnant or nursing women, and other areas. And so that is particularly beneficial for women who tend to be crowded into sort of casual, lowly regulated, low-paid jobs in plantation agriculture. So it can help improve their conditions there.
Very good. Yep. Can you probably enlighten us with some examples about it? Yeah.
Sure. So there's many more examples in the guidebook. One example of a way that the criteria, so the actual text of the standard guidance document, one of the ways that those criteria can promote gender equality is through something I mentioned earlier, which is women's decision-making and empowerment in cooperatives. And so all of the standards reviewed had a gender non-discrimination policy. And so to give you an example, the Rainforest Alliance has a critical criterion which says that all forms of discrimination in labor, hiring, training, etc., are prohibited, including distinction, exclusion, or preference to invalidate, harm, equality of opportunity or treatment in employment, and different pay to men and women. And so most of them were very strong in terms of prohibiting discrimination between men and women. And what's important to note is that in this example and in other examples from the standards cited here, is that the gender non-discrimination policy was a strong criterion. And so basically meaning that the producer organizations must meet this, and it's a fundamental baseline and considered a very high priority area for the different issues that they're asked to comply with. So it's given priority.
Very good. Yep.
And so it's interesting to compare it, though, because there's other aspects of non-discrimination that relate to women's participation in agricultural trainings. And so when we examined this one, we found that there were only 2 standards that specifically required gender non-discrimination in agricultural trainings. And so that was the 4 Cs and the Fair Trade Higher Labor Standard. And then finally, another one that this was an interesting finding from the review and analysis of the standards is that all of the standards analyzed have a provision that childcare must be provided and accessible for workers. So this is more relevant to plantation agriculture. And so this is really important because the unpaid domestic labor that women most often perform is a very difficult thing for a standard to address because it's mostly focused on production. And so the fact that these standards are addressing the issue of providing childcare so that women can perform their paid jobs is an important finding. Although one thing we did notice is that it wasn't always a strong criterion. So it was something that they were given time to comply with, but still it's something that is highly on the radar of the standards bodies.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you for these examples. I mean, they're much more developed in the guidebook, but it gives us some, idea how the analysis was conducted. Okay, so these examples refer to an analysis of the criteria, versus gender concerns and the themes that you have selected. How about how VSSs are implemented on the ground? Because as far as I understand, you have also researched and collected evidence. There's limited evidence, about the impact of the outcomes of the implementation of the standards on the ground, but it's still there is some examples that you went to look at. So what are your findings with regards to standards on the ground and how they are being implemented?
Sure. That was a really important aspect of the research because what the standard says in the document is often not fully representative of what happens when it's actually implemented with producers. And so there's examples of how that works with respect to household food security, the first of the 6 cross-cutting themes. So for example, the household food security related criteria that we find in the standards text refers usually to food security only in the context of a living wage. But standards, when they're implemented, can contribute to household food security in several ways. And so one of them is that the requirement for more sustainable agricultural production methods introduces new subsistence crops and nutrient-dense crops. And so a review of the literature shows that some examples of these additional crops are bananas, legumes, soy, cowpeas. There's other examples, but through intercropping and through shade cover, for example, adopting a standard often increases the availability of nutrient-rich foods for families. Another example is that organic production can make it safer to eat plants that are intercropped with cash crops, like coffee and bananas. Moreover, the higher incomes that have been documented from certified sales can reduce hunger seasons. And so there was a study of Ugandan organic coffee farmers that found that the hunger season had been reduced thanks to the additional income that could purchase needed food in the hunger period. And then another interesting finding through one particular study that we reviewed is that these effects of improvement in nutrient-rich and calorie-dense foods might disappear if men control the income, the household income. And so that's an important finding because providing adequately nutritious food for families is in many societies women's responsibility. And so it's important to highlight that these positive findings often depend on women having control of that income and the ability to use it for household food security.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kathy, for showing out these examples based on research conducted and specific cases studies that we found in the secondary literature. I think to explore a bit further your findings, we know that VSS setting bodies and development organizations on the ground often promote the work, with farmers, groups, and rural communities for advancing standard compliant production as mechanisms for sustainable development. And there are aspects in this day-to-day work on the ground with, farmers, rural workers, and plantations and women to be cautious about that, that can undermine gender equality and woman empowerment in the context of implemented standard compliant production. Can you expand a bit on this, please?
Sure. Yeah, we did find that a lot of the positive contributions that are mentioned in the literature are specific to the context of the study, and often caveats are sort of provided in terms of applying these lessons in other places. So, for example, one area of caution that was identified is that certification provides a financial incentive for cash cropping, but this can be a problem where women are responsible for subsistence agriculture, which might end up being replaced by a cash crop. And so we developed recommendations in order to provide some advice on how to deal with situations like this. So, for example, organizations working with producers can continue to promote women's subsistence crops and nutritious crops for intercropping in shade and other sustainable practices to help to advocate for the importance of women's subsistence agriculture. Another area of caution that was identified is that trainings and information about certified production can reinforce gender inequalities unless an effort is made to directly include women in those trainings. And so organizations who are working in this area, for example, could provide female extension workers. They could make efforts to specifically include women in those trainings. They can support women's literacy so that they benefit fully from trainings. And they can also provide childcare during trainings so that women are able to participate equally to men. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We found another area is that there's prohibitions on child labor in most of the standards, and not always contextualized with the fact that there are places in the world where it's culturally appropriate and not harmful for children of an older age to participate with their mothers in agricultural work. And so organizations can document and work to promote understanding of local cultural practices around children who work in agriculture. And then finally, I think one of the most important findings of the study is that certified production does usually increase the overall labor burden in agriculture to meet quality requirements and environmental sustainability requirements. And many of those tasks often fall on women, depending on the local gender division of labor. And they might not be compensated for that extra work if the husband controls the household income. And so a gender transformative approach can be taken by organizations to work with women and men to understand the local gender division of agricultural labor, and they can undertake gender equality trainings to promote equity in that area.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So thank you for pointing out these 4 examples of examples that can tell us to proceed with caution when working with local communities and farmers groups, and the recommendations that you suggested in the guidebook. I have to say that much of these recommendations relate to do a proper needs assessment, before starting working with the community about where are the gender needs, the gender roles, and the cultural norms lie behind, to be able to adapt accordingly the strategy. So, the guidebook elaborates a bit more on these recommendations, and we invite you all to have a look at it and engage with us as you consider appropriate. So before we move to the questions and answer section with Kathy, I would like to just briefly identify key takeaways from this first session. And the first one is that volunteer sustainability standards can contribute to address and to advance gender equality and women empowerment with regards to sustainable development goals and targets. Okay, it's just not a very important finding. It's just not the content of the standards that matters, the criteria and the indicators that they ask producers to comply with, but more importantly also how they are being implemented. And this is where many stakeholders working with farmers and community works are involved, such as development organizations, practitioners, researchers on the ground, and their own sponsors. And another key takeaway is that development organizations can pay attention to local context and gender norms to promote standards in a way that can promote gender equality and women's empowerment. So those are three main key takeaways before we start the question and answer. So thank you, Kathy, for this very generic vision of the research and the guidebook. And let's start picking up some questions from the audience. I will just open here. Okay, we have a question from Anna, which says the following. I have worked in agricultural research, now working in water research, and have experience working on gender issues in Uganda in agriculture and water. Is there greater participation and access to credit, higher incomes, and credit for labor-saving activities, not also to an extended link to sexual and gender-based violence? Is there greater participation? Yeah. Can you address that question, Kathy?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The way I interpret that is the question is there not evidence that as women's incomes get higher, as they economically become more empowered, is there a risk that there might be a backlash from men, or perhaps even from older women, but people in the community who would then not be very pleased with any sort of change in sort of the gender order locally? That's how I interpret that question. I think that's really important to address. There is one study that I found of fair trade by, I believe the author is Deborah Casente, and she talks a little bit about this. But I can't say that in my review of the literature, I found that this was a widespread finding. There were a few studies that said basically women, what can happen is that rather than promoting more equality or empowerment, the certification process can contribute to men's sort of continued or even reinforced domination within the household. If they control the cash crops, if they control the marketing, they control the production, it's unlikely that the certification process will make any inroads there. In terms of the more problematic result of sexual and gender-based violence, that wasn't a common finding in the literature, but I think it is a very prevalent risk, and agree that development organizations should be thinking about this and concerned about this, and that's where the gender transformative approach has been shown to be effective because that's a means of engaging women and men together in conversations about gender equality, and might be one sort of method of alleviating those concerns.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Kathy. We have another question coming from the chat from Anthony. My question is very generic but very important. How do I introduce voluntary sustainability standards in a country?
The question is, how do I introduce standards?
Yeah. How do I support the introduction of the implementation of voluntary sustainability standards in a country like Nigeria, for instance?
Oh, well, that's a great question. I think it would have to do with reaching out to the local body that is actively promoting the standard, or even reaching out to the standard organization, and also being connected to producers. And so the main issue is that producer organizations or worker organizations, because standards are for both smallholders and waged workers, the important thing is that they become directly connected to the standard body and eventually to a certified importer of their product. And so they have to have adequate resources to pay for the costs of certification and inspection. And so I think it's a matter of sort of developing your base and your relationship with them, finding out what their needs are in terms of getting access to adequate resources to pay for the process, and then assisting them in connecting to a standards organization.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And I think I would like to add also that the enabling environment is very important, because sometimes producers cannot start moving to a standard compliant production on their own. They need support, incentives from different actors. It could be the private sector, it could be the local government, it could be development organizations. So it's an accompanying process that needs some incentives for that.
Mm-hmm.
Good. We have another question from Anna again. My previous work was in the coffee value chain, and the data we collected actually showed that organic farmers were more likely to be kept within the poverty trap versus those in what is commonly known as conventional farming system. Thus, hunger may be reduced on a smaller scale, but possibly growth beyond it hampered. So, Kathy, can you take that question? I mean, there's evidence also of not probably good results applying standard compliant production. So, can you elaborate on that?
I think that's another really interesting and important question. The risk, the way I understand the question is that what is the risk that taking on the financial cost of obtaining certification will exceed the financial benefits and keep people within poverty? And so, for example, my understanding of the global markets for certified products is that there's excess supply of certified commodities as compared to demand. And so sometimes what happens is that producer organizations are paying essentially for the cost of certifying their entire harvest, but they're not able to find a market, a certified market for all of that certified product. And so, mixed in with the conventional coffee or conventional bananas that you're consuming, sometimes you have fair trade, organic, and other bananas that just couldn't find a market that would pay that premium price. And so that's certainly a risk. I think the answer to that question, or the way forward, is to work actively to continue to promote consumption of organic and other certified products from global consumers.
Yeah, and I would like to add to this question that Anna, that his experience we find in other cases too. Cases of producers in Mexico, in Tanzania, in Rwanda that had the similar experience of not having the benefit to the cost, as Kathy was saying. And one of the common research that we can do as ISD is trying to understand what are the factors that contribute to have a positive experience with the standard compliant and production and reducing poverty, and those are factors that are an obstacle for that. So again, it's further research to be done, and because this reality happens all across. Very good. We have another question from Ellen. Experience from other sectors imply that private sector tend to engage with voluntary standards mostly when they legitimately fear that the alternative is creation of legislation regulation.
Oh.
And related research found that the resulting voluntary standards are often rather producer-friendly. What is your take on voluntary versus mandatory standards?
That's an excellent, very political question. Personally, I think the voluntary standards are they're important as an instrument to raise consumer awareness about the importance of the environmental, social, and economic sustainability issues that they address. I think most of us would probably agree that ultimately it would be ideal to have these issues being addressed rigorously in national and international legal mechanisms. But for the time being, I think the standards have done a really excellent job at raising awareness about the importance of these issues. I think maybe fair trade is a very globally recognized label that has achieved that and raised issues of social justice for those who work in the agricultural sector, brought them to a much more sort of prominent level. And that can also contribute to political action. And so the standards are a way of sort of educating people, informing them, developing their interest in sustainability concerns in the way their food is produced. And then with that information, people can get more politically involved and push for strong legal change at the national level. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you, Kathy. Very, very important point that you raised and very good question from Helen. We have another question from Stacy. Kathy, where would you like to see voluntary stability standards going in the future to ensure they are contributing to gender equality and women empowerment in a meaningful way?
Yeah, that's a nice question. Personally, I think one really critical area that has begun to be addressed is climate smart agriculture. And a couple of the standards have started thinking about this and developing particular mechanisms to make access to climate smart agriculture more gender equal. And I think, as we all know, the direction that the world is going is that the capacity for smallholders to both adapt and mitigate climate change is absolutely essential for the future of our planet. And unfortunately, climate smart agriculture is often implemented through mechanisms that do not directly support women's involvement. And so to the extent that, climate change issues as well as gender equality issues are related, we need to be sure that the standards are promoting women's inclusion in any climate smart mechanisms that they adopt in the future.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting, especially because women play a meaningful role, as we mentioned, in food security, as well as managing the natural resources within the household. So they play an important role for mitigating climate change. So standards can play a meaningful role there. Another question, probably is the last one that we have for today from standards. Very practical question, how can a development organization use the information in the report in their day-to-day work? How can you suggest they use this guidebook?
I think, what we have tried to do is synthesize the information throughout the book. And so there's many useful tables and summary tables that you would find useful, I think, throughout the introduction and throughout the content. But mainly, there's several ways. One would be reading the summary of the case studies, on-the-ground information, the actual analysis of, what happens when we roll out standards. So the certification criteria say one thing, and then they play out in multiple different ways with many intended and unintended consequences when they're actually implemented on the ground. And so paying attention to that summary of, what the evidence says so far and what are the local factors that can shape whether standards successfully contribute to gender equality or not. So I think that's a useful thing. And also there's a recommendation section that's summarized at the end of the guidebook and also included throughout, which provides concrete suggestions for what development organizations can do and connects them directly to the Sustainable Development Goals that they would be contributing to by undertaking those actions. So I would point readers to those particular areas.
Excellent, very good. Okay, so you know, we have had a very, very good conversation with Kathy. Very interesting questions coming from Africa and from other countries. Kathy, would you like to close this webinar with some remarks, with some thoughts, with some aspects that you would like the audience to think through?
Sure. I think they're related to some of the takeaways, Christina, that you mentioned earlier. I'd like for people to think about the fact that standards bodies are taking gender equality and women's empowerment seriously. And so from my close reading of their certification criteria and of the literature about this topic, it's clear that it's increasingly integrated and incorporated in a meaningful way. So this is not sort of the unfortunate usual, you know, add women and stir or tack on gender at the end. But it's integrated into their very substance in a similar way to it's integrated in the very substance of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I think it's important to really think about the role and the potential of standards to contribute to gender equality and women's empowerment, because the organizations are quite dedicated to this issue. But second to that, standards are global documents that are then proliferated and implemented in local contexts which differ dramatically from one place to the other. And so the meaning of the standard in sort of the published document might not be quite the same as the meaning when it's applied on the ground. And so it's very, very important to think about all the steps of working with producer organizations and be as knowledgeable as possible about sort of local gender dynamics and divisions of labor to make sure that implementing the standard will have a positive impact. So even though it might be rigorously addressed in a document, the outcome on the ground might look different if that local reality isn't taken into account.
Very important points, and I would like to add that, as you mentioned, the standards are in process of continuous improvement, so they evolve and they improve the criteria as they collect learning experiences and findings from their implementation on the ground. And regarding this local content piece, which I think is really extremely important, I would like to also bring your previous point is that local structures, such as governments, schools, educators, legal frameworks, they have a lot of responsibilities to advance gender equality and women empowerment. And those development organizations that are working on the ground applying the standards, they can also influence these structures that might have a greater impact and support their outcomes, gender equality outcomes. So yeah, I think these two remarks are very, very relevant for that. I would like to say thank you, all of you, to be part of this webinar today, and thank you, Kathy, to support us today in discussing with us in this webinar. I would like to say that the report is available in ISD website, and you can download it, you can access it, you can share it. And we are going also to host another couple of webinars in the coming weeks, a couple of months, since this topic is very relevant for our work. So we welcome you for the coming editions, and let's stay in tune on this. And Kathy, I would like to pass you the word if you would like to have a final say.
Oh, I'll just say thank you very much to ISD for the support in publishing this research, to IDRC for supporting this research, and to everyone who participated and shows interest in the topic, and for the excellent work that you all do in promoting women's empowerment.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Kathy, and thank you all of you in the